Part 1. The Omen. The salt air in Port Salis usually smelled of rotting kelp and diesel, but today it smelled like burnt ozone and copper. Mila Korolenko stood on the edge of the jagged limestone cliffs, her windbreakers snapping against her ribs. Below, the Black Sea was a bruised shade of violet, unnervingly flat. It wasn't the calm of a peaceful day, it was the stillness of a held breath. She flicked open her weathered moleskine notebook. For 3 days, the sensors her father managed at the Regional Seismic Institute had been stuttering. Not with the jagged spikes of an earthquake, but with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum, a pulse that occurred every 412 seconds. "Mila, it's happening again." She whispered it to the wind, but the only response was the eerie silence of the gulls. Usually, they were screaming nuisances, diving for tourist scraps. Today they were gone. Not a single wing clipped the horizon. "Mila, pressure is at 1,015 hectopascals, but the water level is dropping. That doesn't make sense. Hydrostatics don't just take a day off." She began scribbling a graph, her fingers trembling slightly. Her father, Victor, had dismissed her concerns this morning over lukewarm coffee. "The sensors are old, Mila. The salt eats the wiring. Don't look for monsters in the static." But her father hadn't seen the dogs in town. Every stray in Port Salis had spent the night howling at the ground, not the moon. A crunch of gravel behind her made her spin around. Artem Volkov stood there, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a grease-stained hoodie. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His family ran the local salvage yard, and he spent most of his time hauling rusted skeletons of boats out of the harbor. "Artem, you're looking at the water like you expect it to start boiling." "Mila, I'm looking at it because it's retreating, Artem. Look at the pier. You can see the barnacles on the lower pylons. That's nearly 2 meters of recession in an hour. There's no tide in this part of the basin that acts like that." Artem stepped closer, his brow furrowed. He pointed toward the north headland, where a restricted government facility sat perched like a concrete bunker. "Artem, it's not just the water. My old man's crane hydraulics blew out this morning. Every pressure gauge in the yard went into the red at once. And I saw trucks, white vans, no plates, heading up to the geothermal plant at 4 a.m. They weren't carrying technicians. They were carrying crates marked compressed gas, hazard class 2. "Mila, the geothermal plant? That's been offline for maintenance for months." "Artem, that's what the signs say. But the cooling towers were humming last night. I felt it through the floorboards of the shack. It's a vibration, Mila. Deep. Like the earth is grinding its teeth." Mila flipped back through her notes. The 412-second pulse. The geothermal plant sat directly over the Salis fault, a minor, inactive crack in the shelf. Or so the textbook said. "Mila, if they're injecting something into the fault." "Artem, why would they? Unless they're trying to release pressure. Or create it." Before Mila could respond, the world shifted. It wasn't a shake, it was a lurch. It felt as if the entire cliff had moved 3 inches to the left. A sharp, crystalline crack echoed from the direction of the town, followed by the sound of shattering glass. "Mila, Artem, look." She pointed toward the harbor. The water hadn't just retreated, it had vanished. The harbor floor lay exposed, a graveyard of rusted anchors, tires, and flopping fish. And then, the sound started. It wasn't a roar. It was a hiss. A massive, deafening hiss, like 1,000 serpents, rising from the cracks in the seabed. "Artem, that's gas. That's methane." "Mila, the shelf is collapsing. It's a submarine landslide." The air suddenly turned thick and yellow. A wall of white mist erupted from the ocean floor, not water, but aerosolized gas and sediment. The ground beneath them began to moan. "Mila, we have to get to the school. My sister is there." "Artem, the school is in the flood zone." "Artem, the school is on the old pier foundations. If the ground liquefies." He didn't finish the sentence. He grabbed Mila's arm just as the first real shockwave hit. This wasn't a hum. This was the earth tearing open. A fissure snapped across the road leading to the headland, swallowing a parked car in a cloud of dust. Mila looked back at her notebook, lying dropped in the dirt. The last entry she'd made, the 412-second pulse, was now being drowned out by the screams of the town's emergency sirens. But the sirens were cut short. The power lines whipped like snakes, sparking bright blue against the darkening sky, and then snapped. The sky turned a sickly shade of green as the gas cloud reached the atmosphere. It wasn't a storm from the clouds. It was a storm from the core. Artem, run! Toward the ridge. They raced down the shifting path, the air becoming harder to breathe, tasting of sulfur and old pennies. As they reached the town square, Mila saw her father's car. It was idling in front of the institute, the door hung open. Her father was standing on the steps, shouting into a satellite phone, his face pale with a terror she had never seen. "Victor, I told you the seal wouldn't hold. The pressure, it's compounding. You've turned the shelf into a bomb." He saw Mila and froze. He dropped the phone, reaching out for her, but a massive sinkhole opened between them with a sound like a gunshot. The pavement disintegrated, a jagged maw of darkness separating father and daughter. "Mila, Dad, Victor, go to the hills. Don't trust the shelters. The basement levels are." A secondary explosion, muffled and deep, rocked the ground. A geyser of gray slurry erupted from the sewer grates, knocking Victor backward. "Artem, Mila, we can't stay. The water is coming back." Mila looked toward the horizon. The violet water was no longer flat. A white line, miles long and several stories high, was rushing back toward the emptied harbor. It wasn't a wave of water. It was a wave of displaced earth and pressure, a wall of destruction. Artem dragged her away just as the first buildings on the shoreline began to slide, not into the water, but into the liquefying ground itself. "Mila," he was talking to someone. He knew. "Artem, save it for when we're alive. Move." They reached the school gates just as the wall of water hit the harbor. The sound was like a jet engine. But through the chaos, Mila saw something that chilled her more than the wave. On the hill above the geothermal plant, a fleet of black SUVs was calmly driving away, heading for the high mountain pass. They weren't panic-stricken. They were evacuating according to a plan. And as the water slammed into the town, Mila realized the 412-second pulse had stopped. The timer had reached zero. Part 2. Beneath the surface. The world was no longer Port Solace. It was a fractured archipelago of ruins rising out of a thick, gray sludge. This tsunami hadn't been a clean wave. It had been a slurry of mud, methane ice, and debris. Mila and Artem were huddled in the attic of the town's old library, the highest point on the central ridge that hadn't collapsed. Mila's younger sister, Lena, was curled in the corner, wrapped in a damp curtain, her eyes wide and glassy. They had found her clinging to a basketball hoop at the school just before the foundations gave way. The silence was the worst part. No birds, no engines, only the occasional slap of water against the walls and the distant, rhythmic thud of the geothermal plant's emergency release valves. "Artem, the water's not receding. The sinkholes, they've lowered the elevation of the whole downtown. We're below sea level now." He was cleaning a gash on his leg with a strip of cloth. His face was set in a hard mask of anger. "Mila, it's not just a sinkhole, Artem. Look at the data I salvaged from the school's weather station before the power died." She laid out a crumpled thermal printout. "Mila, the temperature of the floodwater was 40 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't just seawater. It was water from the deep aquifers, heated by the mantle." "Artem, so the geothermal plant tapped a vein they couldn't close?" "Mila, worse. Look at the chemical analysis on the second page. High traces of synthetic polymers and pressurized CO2. They weren't just taking heat out, Artem. They were pumping something in. Carbon sequestration, or maybe chemical fracking. They were using the Solace Fault as a trash can for industrial waste, and they overpressurized it. Artem, my dad's yard, It's all gone. He stayed to lock the gates. He thought it was just a storm. His voice cracked, the first sign of the boy beneath the survivalist. Mila reached out, touching his hand briefly before pulling back to her notes. Mila, we need proof. If we just tell the rescue teams, if they ever come, the company will call it an act of God. A natural disaster. My dad, he was trying to warn them. He has the logs. He said the basement levels weren't safe. Artem, the Institute's basement is flooded. It's under 10 feet of muck. Mila, not the Institute. The geothermal plant. The main server room is in the sub-level 4 bunker. It's built into the granite of the cliff. It's the only thing that survived the landslide. Artem, you want to go back there? Mila, the ground is like pudding. One wrong step and you're buried. Mila, if we don't, they'll just wait for the water to settle, send in a cleanup crew, and delete everything. Those SUVs I saw, they weren't rescue. They were the executives. They're leaving us here to drown in their mistake. Lean up, Mila. I'm cold. Mila looked at her sister. The stakes weren't just about the truth. They were about justice for a town that was being erased. Mila, Artem, you know the old maintenance tunnels. The ones your dad used to scavenge for scrap? They run from the harbor to the plant's cooling intake. If we can get through the dry sections, Artem, there'll be death traps. Pockets of methane. Structural collapses. Mila, I have my dad's handheld gas monitor. And we have your knowledge of the tunnels. We have to try. They set out at dusk. The landscape was a nightmare of twisted metal and half-submerged houses. They used a salvaged, inflatable raft to navigate the streets, paddling past the upper stories of shops where Mila used to buy records. The entrance to the maintenance tunnels was a rusted iron grate near the old cannery. Artem pried it open with a crowbar, the screech of metal echoing too loudly in the dead air. Artem, masks on. If the monitor beeps twice, we run. No arguments. The tunnels were narrow, dripping with a foul, oily liquid. Mila held the gas monitor out like a compass. The air was heavy, making every breath feel like a chore. As they moved deeper, the detective and Mila began to piece it together. They found a section of the tunnel that had been reinforced with brand-new carbon fiber. Unmarked, unofficial. Mila, why reinforce a sewage tunnel? Artem, look at the floor. Those aren't water pipes. He pointed to a series of high-pressure steel lines running parallel to the wall. They were vibrating. Mila, they're still pumping. Even now, they're trying to drain the evidence into the deep crust. They reached a heavy steel door marked Sublevel 4. Authorized personnel only. Artem didn't bother with the keypad. He looked at the hinges. Artem, the shift in the earth warped the frame. It's not even locked. It's jammed. Together, they threw their weight against it. With a groan of tortured steel, the door gave way. Inside, the room was a stark contrast to the mud and chaos outside. It was a high-tech nerve center, glowing with the blue light of emergency monitors. Rows of servers hummed, and in the center of the room, a large screen displayed a 3D map of the Port Solace shelf. A giant red zone pulsated beneath the town. A label read, Project Vulcan, pressure exceedance 140%. Mila, Project Vulcan. It wasn't geothermal energy. It was a high-pressure waste injection site. Artem, Mila, look at the timestamp. They knew the pressure was critical 4 days ago. They had a vent or collapse protocol. Mila, and they chose not to vent. What? Artem, because venting would have released toxic gas into the town. It would have been a massive scandal. A collapse looks like an earthquake. Insurance covers earthquakes. It doesn't cover illegal toxic dumping. Mila, they let the town fall into the sea to save their stock price. A shadow fell across the doorway. They spun around to see a man in a mud-caked uniform. It was Mr. Henderson, the town's mayor, but he wasn't wearing his usual politician's smile. He was holding a heavy industrial flare gun, and his eyes were frantic. Henderson, you shouldn't be here, kids. This is a restricted area. Artem, you knew, didn't you? You took their money to turn the fault into a dump. Henderson, it was supposed to be safe. They promised the rock would hold for 1,000 years. It would have brought jobs, a new pier, a future for this dying town. Mila, there is no town anymore, Mr. Henderson. My father is missing. People are dead. Henderson, I'm trying to fix it. I'm here to initiate the purge. Mila looked at the console. The purge button wasn't an emergency shutoff. It was a total data wipe, coupled with a final, massive pressure release that would trigger a secondary landslide. One that would take the rest of the ridge, including the library where Lena was waiting, into the sea. It would erase the evidence and the witnesses in one final natural tragedy. Mila, you're going to kill the survivors to cover your tracks. Henderson, it's the only way to keep the company from going under. If they go down, the cleanup funds disappear. Nobody gets anything. Artem lunged forward. Henderson fired the flare gun, the blinding red phosphorus screaming past Artem's ear and hitting a stack of crates. Smoke instantly began to fill the room. In the confusion, Mila dove for the terminal. Her fingers flew across the keys. She didn't try to stop the pump. She didn't have the codes. Instead, she opened the satellite uplink. Mila, Artem, keep him busy. Artem tackled Henderson, the two of them crashing into a row of server racks. Mila grabbed her notebook, frantically typing the IP addresses of the Regional Seismic Institute and every news outlet in the capital. Mila, uploading. Come on, the bandwidth is crawling. The screen flashed. Upload 45%. 60%. Henderson kicked Artem away and scrambled for the terminal. He was crying now, a pathetic, broken man. Henderson, you don't understand how the world works, Mila. The truth doesn't rebuild houses. Mila, maybe not. But lies won't bring them back either. The purge sequence began to count down on the secondary monitor. 0:30, 0:29. Artem grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher and smashed it into the primary cooling pipe above the servers. A jet of freezing liquid CO2 erupted, clouding the room in white frost. Artem, Mila, get the drive and let's go. The whole place is going to blow. Mila watched the progress bar hit 100%. She yanked the physical hard drive from the rack, the metal burning cold in her hands. Mila, it's sent. Now we run. They scrambled back toward the maintenance tunnel as the countdown hit 0. But instead of a digital wipe, the physical destruction of the cooling system caused the servers to arc and explode. A wall of fire roared through sublevel 4. Henderson didn't follow them. He sat in the middle of the burning room, staring at the screen that now read, broadcast complete. Part 3, the breaking point. The air outside was screaming. As Mila and Artem emerged from the cannery tunnel, the ground didn't just shake. It tilted. The secondary landslide Henderson had feared, or hoped for, was starting. The pressure they had released was tearing the very foundation of the cliff away. Artem, the library. Mila, the ridge is going. Mila looked up. The old stone library, where she had left her sister, was silhouetted against a sky lit by the orange glow of the burning geothermal plant. The ground between them was a river of moving mud and shattered timber. Mila, we have to get to her. Artem, there's no path. The road is gone. Mila, the cable car. The old tourist line. It was a rusted relic, a gondola system that used to take visitors to the top of the cliffs. It was ancient, but the cables were anchored deep into the granite peak, not the shifting shelf. They ran toward the lower station. The platform was half submerged. Artem jumped into the control booth, frantically throwing switches. Artem, no power. The grid is dead. Mila, the backup generator. It's a diesel manual start. She found the crank in the back of the shed. It was heavy, slick with rain and oil. She threw her weight into it, her muscles screaming. Crank, crank, cough. Mila, please. Not now. Artem joined her, his strength adding to hers. With a violent shudder and a cloud of black smoke, the old engine roared to life. The cables began to groan, moving with agonizing slowness. Artem, I'll hold the override. You get in. When it passes the library balcony, you have to jump for it. Mila, what about you? Artem, I'll catch the next car. Just get Lena. Mila climbed into the swaying metal gondola. As it rose over the devastation, she saw the true scale of the crime. Port Solace was a map rewritten by greed. From this height, she could see the swirling vortex where the harbor used to be. The gondola creaked as it approached the library. The building was groaning, stones popping out of the facade like loose teeth. Lena was on the balcony, clutching the stone railing. Mila, Lena, jump. The gap was 4 feet. The gondola swayed in the wind. Lena looked down at the churning mud 30 feet below and froze. Mila, look at me, Lena. Only at me. Jump. The library gave a sickening lurch. The balcony began to tilt. Lena screamed and leaped. Mila caught her by the jacket, pulling her onto the floor of the metal car just as the library's entire front wing slid into the abyss. Mila, I've got you. I've got you. They looked back for Artem. The lower station was being engulfed by the rising slurry. Mila, Artem, the next car. Get on. But the engine was failing. The black smoke was turning white. The generator was seizing. Artem looked at the machine, then at the girls in the retreating gondola. He knew if he let go of the manual override to jump into a car, the whole system would slide backward down the cable. He stayed at the lever. Mila, Artem, no? Jump. Artem. Keep the drive safe, Mila. Tell them what happened. The station floor collapsed. Artem vanished into the shadow of the structure as the gondola reached the safety of the upper granite peak and locked into place. Mila, Artem. Silence. Only the sound of the wind. Mila sat on the cold stone of the upper ridge, holding Lena and clutching the hard drive to her chest. She watched as the first search and rescue helicopters appeared on the horizon, not from the company, but from the military. Her broadcast had worked. The data, the pressure logs, the chemical signatures, the emails from Project Vulcan was already being mirrored across the internet. Hours later, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a figure emerged from the mud-caked ruins near the ridge's base. He was limping, his arm hanging at a strange angle, but he was moving. Artem had climbed the cable itself, hand over hand, using the last of his strength before the station fell. He collapsed onto the grass as Mila ran to him. He was covered in gray silt, looking more like a ghost than a boy. Artem, did it send? Mila, every single bite. The whole world knows. Artem looked out at the remains of their home. The water was finally still, reflecting a pale, cold dawn. Artem, it's gone, Mila. Everything. Mila, not everything. She looked at her notebook, the edges singed but the pages intact. She looked at Lena, who was finally sleeping. Mila, they thought they could bury the truth under a town. But they forgot that we know how to dig. The recovery would take years. The court cases would take decades. Port Solace would never be on a map again, at least not in the same place. The disaster was a scar on the earth, a permanent reminder of what happens when the planet is treated like a ledger. But as the first rescue boat drifted into the new bay, Mila realized that they weren't just survivors. They were the witnesses. And for the first time in a week, the copper smell in the air was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of the open sea. The pulse had stopped. The earth was finally quiet.